Oh, should we introduce each other like really quickly?
Okay. Do you want to try and
Introduce you? Sure.
yeah.
Uh-oh. Well, Daniel Mroz is the doctor. Is Dr. Daniel Mroz is the head of the theater department at the University of Ottawa, which is in Canada, and he's he's been a good friend of mine for I don't know. I think it's almost 15 years now.
It's like 12, I think.
12,
2007,
yeah.
2008.
Yeah. So he wrote a book on martial arts, Chen style Tai Chi's relationship to theater, and he is a lifelong practitioner of Chinese martial arts with a background in Southern styles initially, and then focusing on the internal styles. And he has a kind of haphazard engagement with Taoist practices through a whole bunch of different teachers that, gives him a pretty broad perspective. And, he's most wonderful for his open-mindedness and his sense of discipline and connection to the idea of continuity and authenticity. I would say, that's really what we bond over. That both are possible, that continuity and authenticity are possible across cultures. So, anyway, that's my intro.
Wow, that was super generous. There's one thing that if this ever does actually become something
to
publish,
add the name of it
is like partly true. I don't run the whole theater department. I run the fine arts part of the theater department. So
just the fine part.
Just the fine.
There's a course arts and a fine arts.
Oh no, there's a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Acting and a Master of Fine Arts in Directing, and I run those. But there's also like a liberal arts program and a Master of Arts program, and there's a wonderful guy who runs the whole thing, and there are lots of do all that running. So I don't want to take credit for other people's stuff.
That's great.
I met Scott because I read things on the internet, and my understanding was kind of like true and kind of false. When I first read Scott's blog, he had all sorts of interesting cultural knowledge about Chinese martial arts and about Daoism and about, I guess, late 20th century dance and theater that were, so those three things are kind of rare to find all together. And so he also has this very engaging way of writing that can delude his readers into thinking that he's figured everything out. He's a very happy, chill kind of person. And so I now know Scott quite well, and I feel like some of those things aren't so true. But because of his online writing, I went down to San Francisco to visit him in what I think was 2007. And we've had this wonderful conversation, really. Occasionally we meet up and, Scott says, well, I've been working on this, and this is always some incredibly hard to do perception scrambling body effect. And then I can never do it. And that's usually how those meetings go. And so we do a lot better being on the same level, and we're speaking kind of more historically and conceptually, I think. And in fact, something that I may be blowing this introduction really badly, because this makes me think of actually why I wanted to ask you today what you think of this. There's all of these different phases or levels in various Chinese martial arts. Like Xing Yi Quan has this, you've got Mingjing and then Anjing. Jing, and then there's this, Taiji has like umpteen.
So Ming means obvious. Jin means hidden or mysterious, or
it's Ming, An, and Hua.
An is like circuitous,
Okay.
and qua is transformative, or
Yeah.
like chemistry, like water changing to gas or something.
Yeah. So I suppose I'm
And
thinking of
other
this, and
systems
then
have these systems divided into various named
yeah.
mechanisms.
Another good friend of mine, I think someone Scott knows or knows of, Sam Masich makes these great Taiji, Yang Taiji curriculum handouts, and there's like a million different energies in Yang style Taiji. And one of the later ones is this Lin Kuo
72 or a million?
70. Oh, I don't know. It's probably about 23, but to me it feels
Yeah,
like
yeah.
closer to a million. So there's this empty force, and we've seen all kinds of very optimistic people playing with non-contact martial arts under the name of empty force. And I'm wondering if like things like Huajing and Linkonjing, this empty force, are these in the category of things that you've been abilities or effects that you've just been recently writing about, where you've been talking about how you defeat someone's perception of their own balance by making them think they're well balanced when they're actually leaning on you, or making them think that they're out of balance when in fact they're functioning really independently.
Mm.
So are these later phases?
The two major illusions, right,
Yeah.
are that you think you're balanced but you're not, or
Mm-hmm.
you think you're off balance but you are.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
and you can create distortions in movement and control people because they misperceive the truth of their balance. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the spectrum of these, from very, very obvious to very, very subtle powers in Chinese martial arts along that spectrum, I'm curious, do you think that the rarefied end of that spectrum is mostly composed of tricks, as opposed to passing through this whole phase of, I'm sort of efficient, and now I really know how to move my body, and I generate an awful lot of force, and I can skip around very, very effectively. I'm both elusive and powerful when I hit, so there's that kind of efficiency in the middle. And then we get to, and actually every interaction you have with someone at that level, you're getting the wrong information. And so I'm curious to know, because there's a whole category of stuff that is, seldom seen or shown under very, very controlled circumstances. And is that in fact what we're talking about? Because I think this is you've made a lot of contributions, but I think this is your big contribution, is to point out that from a contemporary understanding of movement perspective, a lot of the skills that are found in Chinese martial arts are the skill of diluting the other person from contact. And perhaps, if this Ling Kun Jing business can be believed, diluting the other person without contact. That one seems a bit more optimistic. But yeah, what do you think of that?
Okay. Well, man, there's a lot of material in there. Let me see if I could just pull stuff out, and if I forget something, let me know, or we could just bat it back and forth. Clearly, if you deal with the world of dueling, it's all about deception. Great duelers, they just stab you, and you don't know how it happened. It's you because you bought the bait, right, or whatever it was, and there's an enormous effort. I mean, that's mostly what dueling is. Right? The reason you're good at sword work is because the other person can't figure out what you're doing. Right? So it's not just the touch game.
Mm-hmm.
There's that visual spatial game happens outside of touch. But there are some particularly cool illusions that happen when you touch, because we have, well, I mean, I'm speculated in that one blog you're referring to that there's 3 mechanisms, and maybe it's more, but that there's a touch mechanism of balance. So you actually balance by making contact with other things.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the balance that's based on your visual field, how you perceive yourself relative to things that you think are stable, I guess, something like that. It also, because because it works in motion, it's also related to how your brain perceives patterns. If you're running by a bookcase, you're actually not seeing something stable, right? You're seeing something changing. But we have amazing capacity to visually function in terms of pattern, to make our balance apparatus functions. Our balance in motion and activation functions via the perception of patterns, not just, say, lines or stable objects. But I mean, there's just some facts there, right? So there's a visual thing, and then there's this inner ear thing, which I don't know, it doesn't seem that fast to me, but it's like there's a part of it that's quick, which is like orient, disorient. So it's like, oh, I'm off, oh, I'm on, or like you have to stop to check it or something. Like if you're wiggling, unless you're always wiggling, then that becomes some stability. So it's pretty tricky. What are these three types of balance things? But because they're all a little bit whack, they're all susceptible to deception. You could conceivably attack any one of them, and then the brain would have to go, wait, these are incongruent, and you create a delay, and then you can add an illusion on top of that. And so I don't know anybody else who's talking about the problem of that way. That's not a problem, right? If we're just talking about tricks, there's no problem there. The problem is in the presentation and this idea that someone's claiming overwhelming power when it's actually the illusion of overwhelming power, for example. But let me actually dig back. There's another. So I'm taking off little pieces, then I'm going to dig back to the beginning.
Okay.
The other one is this sort of question about efficiency, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a great deal of martial arts, and dance for that matter, when you're talking technique, because dance outside of technique, why do they care about efficiency? They really don't. But I think it's true in martial arts too. Like, you only care about efficiency in the sense that, like, you got to last to the end of the fight. I mean, unless you're talking about training technique, right? And then you get into this conversation about efficiency. And there's really two types, right? There's energy efficiency and power efficiency. And humans, at some point, not very long ago in our evolution, mastered energy efficiency, which means that we can carry stuff and we can walk or run for 25 miles to track down animals. We can carry weapons and track down animals and then carry them home. And that no other animal has that level of efficiency, energy efficiency. And it's a superpower that allowed us to grow our brains because we could eat all that meat, right? It's a very simple evolutionary theory, but so we develop that we have that bias toward energy efficiency, which some people would call laziness. But it's not. It's adaptive. It's an adaptive survival skill.
Does it mean further, like when you start to do a physical action, you're going to want to do one that is easily repeated, like walking or running?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it's look. There's another half to this, which is that anytime you do something over and over, you become more efficient at it, whatever the pattern is. That's just the sort of muscle building 101. If it requires muscle building at the beginning, after 3 months of doing it, your muscles are actually going to go back down in size because you have figured out how to do that motion more efficiently. It's the direction of our evolution, our adaptability. But if we can sort of unravel back to before that, power efficiency. A lot of animals survive based on power efficiency, and we have all the gear, the human equipment for power efficiency, which is energy inefficient. A leaping tiger can't leap all day. They're using all of their energy on that leap, or however many leaps they do, and then they're like, "Whew, good meal. I'm going to sleep." They don't take it anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
They just find a little camouflage and sleep. And so it's that energy efficiency that we actually associate with developing internal martial arts. Not sorry, it's really hard to say this right.
Yeah, do it again.
It's the power efficiency
Right.
that we're looking for in internal martial arts, not energy efficiency. And a lot of people make that mistake, and the long-term consequences has actually become a little bit fragile if you just do energy efficiency work.
Right. In the way that it's like ultra marathoners get very, very thin and sort of unusual adaptation
but
to stress.
but without all of the stimulus, right?
Right.
You're unless you're doing sparring. I mean, it depends on what you're doing, but if you're like doing forms and stuff, they're going to get really efficient. You're going to get skinny.
Right.
So, all right. So, and my position is that internal martial arts are reversing everything, almost everything, or it's basically a set of experiments based on reversal. But I could come back to that. Okay, let me see. What was the key question though that I was supposed to answer? Those were little sidebars.
You said you were going to go back to the beginning, and we were talking about our higher level skills, which is a terrible term, but our higher level skills really based on tricking the other person.
Oh, okay. So I wanted to deconstruct that. Take apart the premise of the question a little bit without being rude. Because I know you actually already know this because we've had this conversation before. But so the problem people have in understanding this subject is that they're seeing it through something I call the YMCA filter, or the YMCA Consensus, which is that after the Boxer Uprising, there was a consensus that Chinese religion, Chinese theater, and Chinese martial arts, which were a single subject, all were bad for China. They were all contrary to Enlightenment goals that really could be emphasized by the kind of secular Christianity of the YMCA as a kind of summary of, build hospitals, build schools, was feminism, the spread of commerce, the spread of ideas. These were all Enlightenment concepts. They weren't strong Enlightenment concepts, but whatever. They were part of this YMCA culture, this missionary culture, which converted essentially all the future leaders of China over the next 40 years. And when I say all, I mean 60%. Direct conversion, maybe only 40%. But, it was enough to rule. It was a large consensus. And even people who were, Buddhist monks and Taoist priests got on board with this program. That is, at least people in power. People who were in power in the country, say between 1900 and 1940, all agreed to the consensus, which changed a little bit. It initially was that we should get rid of what they called the superstitious elements of Chinese religion, and that was largely defined by the way in which martial arts, theater, and religion combined into a single thing, and that was exemplified. The exemplar of that was the Boxer Uprising, where people were possessed by gods of the theater and believed they were invulnerable to bullets. And they, particularly invoked the gods from Feng Shen Yan Yi, the canonization of the gods, which is the one of the most important religious epics in Chinese culture. It's where the god Nejia comes from, the angry baby god, who was the guardian of Beijing. Anyway, I can go on and on like this. The point, right, is that there was this consensus to ignore the way the martial arts were actually created, which was in a culture that was fully integrated theater and religion. Chinese culture is probably the most theatrical culture ever to exist. I mean, we could debate that. Maybe there's another one. But they were deep, deep into their theater and everything important in their world, from medicine to religion to the law, was integrated into theatrical stories and to theatrical performance. And the hierarchies, the way they run their government, all of that was integrated with the theater. And so if we go into this question about hierarchies of learning in the martial arts, we have to then go, okay, so who's teaching who, right? Who's creating these hierarchies and why, right? And so what I argue is that the best teachers were people in the theater, but they were low caste. They were below everyone else. So they had a very strong reason to keep secrets and to play tricks on people. And that they could also get away with it because they were itinerant, right? They weren't legally even allowed to sleep inside city gates. And they were available for sex. So like an illegal category available for sex. Whether they were always sexual or not is nobody knows, frankly. But that's like a special category, right? Where it's like, you know, so these are people who are gonna trick you and you know it, right? That's built in. And then you get, okay, so then they pass on these traditions to other riffraff on the one hand, and also to elites. We know that, at least there's some of that going on.
And the reason for that is that elite, or upper middle class people, want to be acting out theater for themselves, and they need coaches. And they're not going to do it professionally, but they're going to hire these guys to teach them theater.
Yeah, I mean, they say about the princes, not of the Qing dynasty in the last 50 years, most of them weren't that good with, politics or military affairs, but if you wanted them to perform opera, they were good. They were actually spent time mastering it. They just didn't get paid for it because they were already princes, and it would be impossible for them to be professional in that culture. But they would put on shows and invite all their friends.
I'm curious, this is like, I like what you're doing, and I think it will be possible to stay on track with your explanation. Do we have examples of people who are actually, in the late 19th, early 20th century, that we know that these martial arts teachers were from a particular background and were therefore involved with traditional Chinese theater? Because like part of the thesis that maybe people in general don't know, but what you've looked at was there's this opera rebellion that takes place in Fujian province, in the Minanhua speaking group of people, and that gets put down. And essentially, it's a whole bunch of people going into trance, in a religious trance, acting out these gods. They take over and blockade the port in Fujian, and one of the ports, the main port,
Foshan.
Foshan.
Yeah.
And the authorities put this kind of intense fundamentalist folk religion manifestation. They put it down, and so a whole bunch of people who were involved with that have to run away and disguise the fact that they were ever involved in the theater. Disguise the fact that they were involved in particular kinds of religious manifestations. And your thesis is that those people wound up using their mad chops and being able to kick and jump and play the bingzi, the weapon sets. They parley that as martial arts instructors in people's homes. And I'm wondering, do we have more recent examples of that? Like a really crazy one that I just found out about, and maybe if we put this on the internet, all sorts of things will come out. But the gentleman who teaches all that ninjutsu in Japan, I don't know how to pronounce his name properly. Masaki Hatsumi. Anyway, it's Dr. Hatsumi. And a colleague of mine who had studied with him and others in Japan was like, well, Daniel, he's like you. Like, he's got a doctorate in theater. And I was like, really? I thought he had a doctorate in like bone setting or something. But so here we have an example of somebody who has created this extremely theatrical presentation of martial arts.
Are you saying ninjas aren't real?
No, ninjas are very real. Just
okay. Just checking.
Look at the internet.
All right.
Please, I wouldn't dream of saying such a thing. But so I'm wondering, is there like an equivalent here where you could say, oh yeah, actually, I don't know, Dong Hui Chuan's disciple number 3 was actually, because we have a lot of examples of people who are supposed to be involved with the elite battalions, like Yan Ban Ho was supposed to be teaching Ying, all these things. So I'm curious about the recent history of all this.
Yeah, so I don't want to undermine my thesis too much, but the answer is no.
Okay.
But let me explain a little bit about why. So we have this caste, right, of this acting caste that's at the bottom of the culture, and then we have the high-end elites who are studying the same art and performing it, right? And then we have all sorts of stuff going on in between. And at the village level, there are actually lineages, like what you call headman lineages, that would involve playing theatrical roles, which were martial. And so each village, in a sense, had its own high caste or middle caste. It's a little bit hard to sort, but they weren't low caste. Village level experts. And they weren't, they were farmers, right? So that they just practiced 2 months out of the year, something like that. This is completely difficult to sort because, you can find anecdotal stuff. You cannot generalize very easily. Your example of the opera rebellion from 1853, we don't have very good records. Like, we don't know that they were possessed, for instance. That's not certain. We have some accounts from afterwards of them doing acrobatics off the ships onto the castles and stuff like that. But those aren't like eyewitness accounts. There's a kind of fanciful with some theatrical flourish to them, or some political flourish. But we do have accounts that they were dressed in costume, right? And these were alliances between all the theater companies, which had their own boats. So they had, when these boats were armed. So these were, it was actually, they weren't armed like military vessels, but they had cannons. And they, and the triads, what we call the triads now, which were these very secret societies. And what happened there, when they finally were through, they ruled for 2 years. They issued their own coinage, and they wore opera costumes as king and queen and royal families and courtiers. The opera people were all they were playing. You could say they were playing a kind of game, right? A theatrical game that actually made it real for a couple years. When they were finally overthrown 2 years later, there was it was an alliance between the central government up in Beijing and local elites of some kind, who managed to gather together some militias and take back the city, which had been the biggest port city actually in China at that time, I believe. And then they went on a killing rampage, trying to kill anybody associated with triads or theater. And by some estimates, they killed 1 million people just going village to village and going down the roads and looking for people. And then they officially banned opera performance for 15 years. And so during that period, and this is not very well, like there's a lot of controversy about this. Of course, there's probably more documents that could be up unearthed if people were looking at this closely. Only a few scholars have looked at this, but they after 15 years they were allowed to practice again. But during that 15 years, what did they do? Right. Well, that's probably when they started teaching martial arts.
Right.
And because they could sort of allowed to do that if they survived that white terror, the big slaughter. And then also there was a lot of claiming that they were from the north. So it's not in the legal code, but it's been assumed that by some scholars that opera that claimed to be from Beijing or Sichuan, somewhere else, was allowed to perform. That it was only local opera that was banned.
Right.
Anyway, putting all that together, it was certainly a moment that spurred the transfer of the skill set from opera to triads and opera to elites, like the founder of Wing Chun and such.
And we're talking about two, at least when people with our modern lens look back, there's sort of two skill sets. And I just want to ask you to be really clear about it. The performers were low caste people. They owned their own boats. They needed to defend the small fortune in silk that they wore and used as money.
Yeah.
That's why they had cannons. And they had martial arts training, or at least they had combat training, perhaps.
All of them.
Because of the need to defend themselves, because they were the lowest of the low in a violent society. On top of this, they had, the crazy virtuosic level of skill that we associate with Chinese opera and more recently wushu and
acrobatics
and acrobatics and the cinema, but just the virtuosic flexibility, the extraordinary speed, all of these things that are way more gymnastic and athletic than sort of short-handed abilities to defend yourself pugilistically.
Right.
So two skill sets are going out into the world kind of attached to each other.
They start together and they start to diverge in the 20th century, right? But also that basic training was used to train the actors' bodies for the stage, right? It's martial arts that was used. It's actually called, hitting skill. You have to develop hitting skill in order to be an actor. It's like it was the fundamental training of the body that was there. And this is closely related to Daoism, and this is, this is my opinion at the moment, but it's going to come out. It's going to be seen eventually, because Daoism is strictly defined was a job description. A Taoist priest had the job of certifying rituals, and Chinese culture is absolutely filled with rituals. They had the job of certifying that rituals were in accordance with the harmonious running of the government. It was to certify that it was not a heterodox or evil cult. They had that job, and that they had a job all over China, and it was like their primary job, and that's what scholars call Daoism. And then you get these sort of offshoot, like I'm jumping around here a little bit. You get this offshoot that people are more familiar with, which was sort of a mix with Buddhism, called Chuanzhen, or perfect clarity or perfect reality, which is sort of monastic, which people like say in Beijing, White Cloud Temple. And these types of Taoism were not actually really separate. They're sort of trends. People could go back and forth. And you have all sorts of other rituals that Taoists perform, particularly around funerals or around warfare, around communal renewal. Many different types of rituals that Taoists were experts at, that were important. And then there's this whole thing, which is part of Taoist ritual, called the Golden Elixir, which I can get into a little bit, but because it has to do with all these tricks and how the tricks manifest. But the Golden Elixir was much more closely associated with theater than anybody's really been able to lay out. It may not have been originally, but sometime between the 12th and 14th century, so it became integrated with the theater, and certainly by the 1500s, you have you have the Golden Elixir in theater, and right up until the 20th century, you have Taoists temples training actors in the Golden Elixir. They actually were seeking them out as the lowest of the low, because Taoism has this idea that water flows to the lowest of the place of the lowest of the low, and being a Taoist is like being like water. And well, who knows? That's a story, perhaps. But
so they made things that were sort of rare and esoteric available to people you wouldn't think, like the low caste people.
Exactly, and eunuchs too. Right? It's like it was available to eunuchs and actors. So and then these actors are traveling all over the place, and when, as they say, when the circus isn't in town, you got to have some other tricks. When you weren't being hired because the villages are starving, they're not going to hire you. They're going to hire a puppet show. they're going to downscale. Then you got to have other tricks. You got to have other skills, and so teach the Golden Elixir. Teach. You get a following. You leave the theater. You and so maybe you're not allowed to leave the cast of acting, but maybe you teach disciples that are, somewhere of a different caste, and they continue that tradition. So then the Golden Elixir gets spread all over the place. It shows up in many, many different places outside of Taoism directly, but you could say that this is how Taoism spread itself. The Tao Te Ching continued to be a resource for learning the Golden Elixir, and the Tao Te Ching is Taoism's most sacred text. Like I said, like Shioji and Feng Shen Yani, these 100, each of these is like 100 plays. They're huge collections, and they're used for teaching the Golden Elixir. Even of the plays themselves, the texts of the plays are full of instruction in metaphor.
Wow, I'd like to remind us that
what were we going to answer? Yeah,
we're going to answer. Yeah, we're going back to you've been answering my question about these, essentially, where are these tricks and what role do they play in training? And you were answering that by saying, well, you got to look at who is teaching whom in your context. So there's that one thing, and here I'm going to run a really big risk. I'm going to introduce a whole pile of perhaps very esoteric information that will, just add to the confusion of our conversation. But so my friend and former guide when I was traveling briefly in the Himalayas, Ian Baker, has just published this amazing book with Thames and Hudson called Tibetan Yoga. And
awesome!
It is, it's worth telling you this. I was in London, England, and I went to Watkins Books, which is this old-fashioned esotericist bookshop that smells like patchouli and has all
So,
kinds. Yeah, exactly. And I go in and I see Ian's beautiful hardcover. It's Thames and Hudson. It's lusciously illustrated. It's really a hot book. And I see a big pile of them there. So I think, oh, well, I'm going to buy this. And so I immediately go to purchase it. And I want to brag. So I'm telling the guy at the counter, like, hey, my friend wrote this and I haven't seen him in a few years. And I guess that's why I haven't seen him, because he's really busy writing this book. And the manager of the shop says, well, you're coming to the book signing tonight. And I had no idea, right? Last I knew, Ian lived in Bangkok. Anyway, Ian has written this marvelous book that everybody should read, and his introduction is limpidly clear. He's discussing Tibetan Buddhism. He says, well, here we have this tradition that most people who've encountered it in Asia and in the West have encountered a tradition of scriptural study and a tradition of ritual magic. And the actual physical practices that yielded the original insights on which this ritual magic and scriptural accounts were based have not been widely disseminated. And my goal with this book is to present stuff that people haven't known about.
mm-hmm.
So that incredible clarity when you ask what is Tibetan yoga, and you can Google it and watch people leaping about and really pounding themselves and doing some very, very athletic looking things.
You should also mention you and I wrote a comparative essay
we did
for the Journal of Taoist Studies on comparing Dao Yin and toJo.
and this Trilkor, Tibetan yoga. Yeah. So Ian's book is very much an elaboration of what all that material is. I'm wondering because, there are things that you mention a lot, and I think people either don't know what they are, or they're using 20th, 21st century equivalents or definitions. So one of them is theater, and I hope we've cleaned that up a little bit in this conversation. But the other one is, what the heck is the golden elixir? Because you say, oh, it's this particular sort of esoteric religious practice that gets, or personal transformational practice that, can be found in various places and moves around and gets disseminated. But is there a clean way, much like Ian's introduction, where he said, yeah, there's this one thing that's missing. We've got ritual magic, we've got scriptural study, and we've got these physical practices that yield the actual insights. And those have been kept hidden or have not been widely taught. And I'm wondering, is the golden elixir kind of a Taoist equivalent to all that? And is there a good way of summarizing the golden elixir in such a straightforward manner?
I did try to do that in my book. I did try to meet that challenge, but I feel that the way you ask the question really requires a much more eclectic answer. And so I'm thinking here. That picture I have on the back wall is an image of the golden elixir. I can't reach it.
That's the rabbit that lives in the moon.
Yeah. Let's see.
Chinese in Taoist.
Yeah, it's a rabbit under a tree on the moon, grinding the elixir of immortality. And this type of image is ubiquitous. And when Tantric Buddhism came to China, the imagery completely overlapped. So the image of the heart opening like a lotus flower in all directions is also an image of the golden elixir. And I can tell you exactly what I do at this point, but I would have to preface that by saying that the most fundamental, orienting concept of the golden elixir is flipping the world upside down, turning it inside out, inverting it, reversing it, taking something back to its source, return. That these spatial metaphors are actually applied to the method itself. So you practice a method and then you reverse it or you flip it in some way. Is the most fundamental
Mm-hmm.
concept. And so then I can tell you what I do, which is very straightforward. You empty the body of all intent. There's ways of establishing this in the Tibetan tradition called Nindro. You do like 1,000 prostrations. In the Chinese tradition, you just practice your forms until they're completely empty, which is exactly the opposite of what the modern YMCA version of martial arts applications on YouTube is telling people to do. It's exactly the opposite. You want to completely empty the forms of all intent. And once you've done that, then your body is empty and the chi floats outside. So there's this thing, like your body is dead and chi automatically floats out. It's what happens in stillness. It's actually it's what happens if you're just still anyway. You drop all intent and the chi will float off. And so you get this kind of egg, like you're the yolk and the white of the egg floats off. And then to be able to do that movement, your body has to be utterly empty of intent. And then you could sort of, that's not very hard. But then how do you control that or move that? And the answer is by what's called shun, or your spatial mind out beyond that. So you actually, you orient your perception as if you were the space, and you move the space. And this actually reorganizes your entire, muscle skeletal structure, which is something that I call neigong. It's the remaking of the body as a single unit. And if you look at Golden Elixir texts, they call this the consolidation of Jing, right? And unfortunately, that word coagulation, and then that Jing, because Jing can mean sperm, so then that gets really confused in translation. But it just means that the physical body becomes denser. And let me just say, if you are talking about yoga and Tantra in India in the 6th to the 12th century, this is the same subject. Like, it's gotta be. They're too close. And there's so much connection. And when you look at it from a theater point of view, it's like, well, the monkey, Sun Wukong, the monkey, he's a yogi. It actually says it in the book that he's a yogi. It's his yoga that allows his body to be so dense that nothing can penetrate it. It's like, oh wait, that's the same thing. And I could go on and on like this. It's actually a description of the Elixir practice. That fire and water become metaphors for the physical body and the chi that floats off. You can't distill fire from water unless you're free of desire, as the way they put it in more Buddhist terms. But intent and desire are not fundamentally different categories. They're the same.
We're never going to get out of this web. I have another question that you just said, but no, I think it might be.
By the way, there's an article in the most recent Tricycle, which I can link to this if we present this publicly, called "The Buddhist Origins of Yoga." Pretty good.
Yeah, you were talking about forms, and you're being a bit critical about what I see as a trend too, where people are extremely neurotic about taking the Taolu of Chinese martial arts and making sure that there's some kind of small tactical function for every square inch of the Taolu.
Yeah, it's application theater.
Yeah, so you unfortunately, we usually see a rather incompetent attack followed by a brilliant defense.
Because putting on a hat and combing your beard, you have to hit somebody with that elbow.
Right.
It's like okay. You have to block something when you put on your hat and comb your beard.
When you're talking about doing forms until they're empty, does that presuppose that when you start off, you've had appropriate instruction and you have some sense as to how these movements are useful in a confrontation, and you make them second nature, and so you're no longer preoccupied with that? Because I have a feeling that Chinese Taolu in Chinese martial arts have become this kind of artifact where people are, that's why people are being neurotic about it. It's not that they're empty of intent and then they get corrupted by people trying to cram 2 million applications into them. It's that they're these artifacts that people are like, oh God, I wish I knew why I was doing this. And really, people are waiting for some kind of explanation. So I feel like you stop that. You've got, we've got a situation of being really neurotic about one-to-one correspondences between movement and tactical application, and that's one neurotic thing. And then we've just got kind of having inherited something, you don't know quite what it is. And I think when you're talking about forms being empty of intent, you're talking about some other thing, right? We're not kind of low-level hypercompetence or incompetence and ignorance. You're talking about something else. Could you describe that a bit more?
Okay, so I really spend a lot of time these days just trying to get people to, like, can we start from the assumption that the only reason people practiced martial arts was so they could fight? Like, let's drop that nonsense. People were doing it because they loved theater and they were religious people, and it incorporated everything that they loved. I mean, it was deep stuff. It was, and it was not individual even in that sense. Like, what's your achievement? It was like merit. It's a communal merit. Like, you're doing this for your community, and you start as a kid, right? Even if you didn't start as a kid, your responsibility to learn it started as a kid. You grew up knowing, oh, I'm going to be that guy who learns that art because it has a purpose. It has a social purpose. There's a religious purpose. It has a martial purpose too. And we don't know exactly how these martial arts played out in fighting. We don't. There's a lot of good explanations. It's not to claim that applications are wrong. Because, sometimes you see an application, you're like, well, that's really cool. That would work. First of all, that would work. Second of all, it's elegant and has other, physical body coordinating it things. So it's not like I'm anti-application or something. It's just that let's just use Rory Miller's thing. Like, okay, I want you to be able to fight. I want to bring out your innate predator in 2 days. I'm going to teach you 4 things. We teach you how to target and where to target on the enemy, right? On the other person. Like really, depending on what kind of stuff you're doing, there's really 2 targets. It's like the throat and the right here, the lower ribs. You can add the groin. You can get into leg breaks and finger breaks and eyes and other stuff. But really, the big targets like here and here. And okay, so with targeting, you're gonna work on targeting. Okay. There's no reason for a form at all if you're working on targeting. 0 reason for a form. Okay. And then you're going to work on, can you improve your position? Like, what's a better position to be in, right? And if you're really learning self-defense, you're going to start from being attacked from behind. Like, you're going to start from the worst position and improve your position. You're going to start from, oh, I got hit on the head, I'm crumpled up, and I can't see out of my left eye, and now how do I improve my position? Right. And I'm being analytical here, but you could do this live action. You just practice, put yourself in a bad position, make a better position. You could teach this with push hands too. You could teach this with in other formats. But if you want to make somebody decent fighter, like a competent, capable fighter in 2 days, targeting, right, and improve your position, and then you're going to do. What are the other 2? unbalancing the other person and messing up their structure, right? So you're going to practice, how do you mess up somebody's structure and how do you knock them off balance, right? And none of that requires forms. Like, get those 4 things down, really work them. And then, you know what's next on the list? Power training. You can start adding power training. The first thing you're going to do is drop steps, like boxing. You're going to learn drop steps. And after that, probably the next thing is ground fighting, frankly, or weapons. I don't see forms coming out of that. I just don't see it. And so, yes, if you've got, okay, this is the thing. There is a place that forms come out, and it's in what you call operant conditioning. So an attack happens and you create a sudden explosive response. Shaolin is full of this. A sudden explosive response to a stance, right? And this is a really good thing to train kids or people who are smaller, right? Because the chance, if you're suddenly attacked, you can go into a sudden stance with a lot of power. There's a chance you cause the other person to freeze. And then you fight, you fight to another stance, and you fight to another stance. And this gives you enormous structural integrity. It's not dueling, it's not match fighting. It's like, how do I cause the other person to be shocked into freezing, so I can get away or cause serious damage to a vulnerable area. So you can make an argument that the traditional forms, and when I say forms, I mean postures that you hold, and you get pounded into. So they test you constantly. Are you in the stance, right? Can you keep your head still when they push on it, right? This kind of training. This is a good connection to forms, but not to long forms. Not to forms that are the length of Chinese martial arts. Maybe a short karate form or something. I mean, some of the Southern style forms are short. Xingyi, some of the stuff is short, but the vast bulk of Chinese martial arts does not qualify as a martial art if you define it by what you need to fight. It just doesn't qualify. So I knew that a long time ago, but I had the model of dance, right? I had the model of having studied Indian dance and various types of African dance, and Congolese dance, particularly, or Haitian dance, and I knew I could fight with those arts. And I knew they weren't putting those forward as these are fighting arts. They were like, these are types of expression. These are storytelling. These are communal rituals. And so I was like, oh, well, then that explains why people would create forms, right? They're doing communal ritual. They're doing storytelling, and they want to be able to fight with it. Of course. Who doesn't want to be able to fight? It's sex and fighting, man. Everybody wants it. I mean, unless you're a Quaker, but whatever.
So.
Oh, back to
go back to it. Do you want to pause the arc of this?
So why do we have this? So why do we have these levels? Like the Xingyi has the Ming, An, and Hua levels. Well, I think they are modeled. Those 3 are modeled on the Golden Elixir. They're essentially, they're reversals of each other. So you do what's obvious, hard, clear, visually clear, and then you reverse it. You do the same thing but with softness, right? Actually, a kind of inversion, and then you reverse it again. So you do it with no root at all, and with a body that has become like liquid gold. This is a Golden Elixir idea, right? There's like 5 elements, right? You start with wood, which is like growing your fingernails and getting taller, right? And stretching out length, stretching in general. And then you have wood, and then you have fire, which is hollowing out, like the roof of the mouth, palms, hollow. It's like it's a certain type of, and is highly theatrical. It's like, I'm a fire person. I will now tell you what you should be doing with your spinach. Right? I'm a fire character, right? No, I'm a wood character. I'm mixing with the people to learn their skills, right? These are characters. The character source physicality. And then you have the earth, which is like, it's like everything hanging on your bones, on your structure. Like, hi, I'm an earth guy. I'm here to fix your plumbing.
I think we've just legalized earth guys up here in Canada.
Nice, man. And then there's there's water guys. I've mixed, so water goes before, it depends, it's a circle, but water goes before wood. So the water ladies, right? Oh, here to be a water source for you. It's, there's an entire theatrical tradition of performing on boats and performing on barges. And so the water element's like huge element. Oh no, I'm going to run out of battery.
Vietnamese water puppets.
Yeah. Oh my God. Gorgeous stuff. Yeah. And then you got metal, which is like, right, which is like the Jin Gong, right? The diamond body Buddhas, right? Characters, like, people who have achieved the diamond body, which again is an Indian image of the hardened body. And then the golden elixir is like going to water as a hardened body. So you have the quality of water, but you're completely unified. So you're liquid gold. That's what it is. It's your like golden elixir body is this liquid gold. It's like the highest level of Jing is fluid Jing. It's completely solid, but it's soft when you touch it, but it's still all on. Like
so each of these elemental phases, the change is a reversal. And when you've done the complete cycle,
you make the hop.
More major reversal.
Yeah. And so, if you're just teaching amateurs, well, keep them in the low level, keep the money coming, Right. I mean, if we're talking about, it's like deception in the teaching of martial arts is way underrated, understood. Because the Chinese adopted our concept of honest uprightness. It wasn't foreign to them, by the way. They had this idea, but this is a key idea that came from Paul Katz. China did not have communal piety, did not have communities of pious values. If you didn't like what the god was doing, you tied him up and you put him out in the sun to roast because he wasn't behaving well. You taught him. The purpose of Kung Fu as theater is to teach the gods to behave better. And if you don't like the temple you're going to, you go to another one with a different set of values. They didn't have communal piety. So when the YMCA showed up and said, everyone has to share the same communal values for a nation to flourish, right? It's a kind of fascism, actually. It has to share the same sort of values for a nation to flourish. The Chinese were like, well, I mean, they implemented it themselves, but it led to a lot of murder.
Sure. I just basically had this fragment of the conversation with my friend here, Doug Woolidge. Doug translated the Wu Style Tai Chi Chuan Golden Book.
Yeah. I haven't been able to read that, I don't think.
I'll give you mine. So Doug he teaches Chinese for diplomats in the Canadian government. And
wait, can you hang on for just a second?
Yeah, so we were talking about this period in Chinese history, like the late 19th, the early 20th century. And Doug was talking about all of the these kinds of various programs that were there to that wonderful book about physical culture and the normative Christian consensus, the YMCA stuff, Marrow of the Nation, for instance. So
Morris, yeah.
yeah, Andrew Morris. So implicit in that title, for those of us who are used to the idea of nation states, is like, oh, we want to nourish the nation because the nation has become weak, and now we want to rebuild it. And what Doug reminded me was that not only was there this idea of strengthening the nation, but with the idea of strengthening the nation was giving everyday people all over China the idea that they're all part of the same nation, which apparently, and I think it explains a lot, people were regionally or even, identified to their village and their family, and maybe regionally identified, but this nation building project, which was kind of a
and language, right? They had separate languages. They had the same written language, but there was at least 7 major dialects.
So we've got a really diverse situation. And anyway, I'm just kind of repeating what you just said, but my friend, the translator and historian there, just brought this up to the fore just last week, that really the project of making everybody have this common piety, the way you described it, was part and parcel and really indistinguishable from this idea that you're all part of this, we're all in the same boat now and we have to improve the boat. Whereas people previously perhaps had not really thought of the boat being that large.
And thus deception is a major issue. So this is, I think I explained this in one of my blogs and not one of my videos. The Goujian, King Goujian.
Mm-hmm.
You know this story, right? So if you say, hey, I'm a Westerner who's learned martial arts, like you'll get this a lot from Chinese people in general, particularly no, actually, this is really common throughout all Chinese culture when I think about it. Is that they'll say yeah, okay, you learned some stuff, but you haven't tasted bitter.
Oh, and, yes, you told me this whole story.
Right, and everybody interprets that as, oh, you haven't worked hard enough, or there's something in the culture that you'll never get because, your life's too easy or something like that. And it's actually a reference to the Goujian story that everybody knows. And the story is actually about revenge, right? It's about waiting 20 years to get your revenge is what the story is about, right? That this king loses the kingdom, and rather than kill him, rather than be killed, he's put as a shit shoveler in a horse stable for 20 years. And then he's so nice to everybody that the king that conquered him finally gives him his freedom. He goes back home. He starts slowly organizing an army, but he can't do it fast. And so to remind himself, he hangs a gallbladder from I don't remember, it was a bear gallbladder or something, from the door, from the door. So everybody walks by, he licks it to remind himself to taste the bitterness, so he doesn't forget his revenge. And then he also wears fur coats in summer and goes bare-chested in winter. So it's like make his life really, he's like intentionally suffering so that his revenge will be sweeter, basically, more ferocious and sweet. And he I forget how many more years he takes before he organizes an army and then conquers. But that's the story. Tasting bitter is actually referring to how you manage revenge. And so when a Chinese person is saying to you, oh, you haven't tasted bitter, they are messing with your head. There's a level of deception going on there. They're not talking straight unless you, there's an answer. They're like, no, I haven't tasted bitter, but I have worn a fur coat in summer. It's like, and I will get you when you're not looking. That's the
So the
implication.
implication of saying you haven't tasted bitter is you're not crafty enough. You haven't learned
You're
this.
never going to see the deception because you're not even
Yeah.
looking for it.
Right. Yeah. And how conscious is that? Do you think? Is it like? How can I say? No. Like, is it just a cultural thing that
We always do this to foreigners. Yeah. Kind of thing. Yeah.
And I imagine that lots of cultures have this kind of idiosyncrasy, but this one is particularly significant to our.
Yeah, like if you drink whiskey with me, you better be honest.
Right.
And I'm going to keep your secrets.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we have these kinds of traditions too, and for a foreigner, is not going to know that that's what drinking a whiskey means.
Right.
It's hidden, and we don't even have a story about it exactly. I don't know how it arose, but yeah, if I find out that you told a secret that I let you know while we were drinking whiskey, I mean, I'm going to shoot you, or I mean, I might not shoot you, but that's the implication, right? It's there.
Cool. So we were talking about the Paul Katz material, where you've got this very flexible relationship to the divinities, that you're pulling the statue out of the temple and whacking it in the sun if the god is not providing rain, for instance.
Yeah.
And so I'm just trying to, if we do ever have an eventual audience for this, and I kind of hope we do, it's very interesting to me, so I hope it's interesting to other people, but just that there's a pathway forward. So we're discussing these very, sort of, for us, open and flexible attitudes, and the purpose of the practices.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Chinese religion's really cool, and it's a comic religion in that sense, right? And this is really hard for people in the West to understand. I mean, maybe not everybody.
Well, you did this thing the other day that I thought was really good about, you just said, well, tragedy is where the central figure doesn't change and everything around them changes and they refuse to change and they have a bad time. And comedy is the central figure changes far too much for what's happening around them and creates a kind of hysteria. Yeah. So,
and that comes from the theater, right?
Yeah, but those are really
organized around the theater, so it's natural.
I've been really thinking about those a lot because that might be, like, professionally, I was like, oh, is there something missing from those definitions? But they seem really wonderfully concise and immediately descriptive. So as you say, a religion is comic, with that definition of comedy in mind, that the central figure changes too much with respect to what's going on. How is a religion comic? What do you mean by that?
Well, it's easier to start by saying, by recognizing that the dominant Western religion that we spread to the rest of the world was tragic, and it may be harder to swallow, but it's worth considering. That because Jesus on the cross is a tragic figure to begin with, right? He can't change because his arms are nailed to the cross, right? He's stuck in that open position as a sacrifice. And the idea that religion is a set of beliefs that you won't give up, no matter, or a faith that you won't relinquish, no matter what's happening around you, no matter what bad things happen to you, no matter how shipwrecked you are, no matter how downtrodden you are, you don't give up your faith. That is the definition of a tragic religion. And I don't mean that the results are inherently sad or something. That's not what I'm saying. I'm specifically referring to this: don't change your beliefs in relationship to the world around you. And I could really maliciously argue that science is like that, but it's really scientism that's like that. Right? It's like these are the truths that we're keeping right now, and when the experts say that they've changed, well, There isn't really, in scientism, there isn't really that assumption that the scientists will change their mind. It's really a progressive concept, right? That science just accumulates and gets better and more accurate. And that's a tragic view. A comic view would be, oh, new discovery. Germs. That was baloney.
Right.
It's something else. That would be a comic. Anyway, I'm suggesting here of science as emerging from a Christian religious worldview.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the comic? What is the comic religion? Well, the comic religion
there's no consequence to change, or at least there's not this perceived negative consequence to change.
Yeah, it's all about how quickly can you adapt, right? It's like, oh, the gods aren't behaving well. Well, we need to change something. We need to do a ritual down here to change the position of the gods. The gods who are controlling the weather are behaving badly, so we should beat them up.
Right.
It's like, there is a tragic element to Chinese culture, which is this idea of harmony, right? That you're going to create some kind of stable state by constantly balancing things and bringing things into alignment. But implicit in that is that sometimes things get really wacky and out of alignment. So I don't think it's fair to say that, in Christianity too, I think you can find lots of comic elements in it too. I don't mean to narrow it that much, to narrow the lens or the dichotomy. It can become narcissistic in the sense that it becomes rigid. But certainly, if you're worshiping a monkey king, that's a crazy guy. He's a wild and crazy guy. If your favorite deity or immortal is John Sun Feng, and what he does is he flips things upside down. I mean, you're constantly looking for how to get a new funny twist on the world. Yeah, I mean, like there's Meir Shahar has a collection of essays by all sorts of authors called Unruly Gods. And it's all about these badly behaved gods and why people worship badly behaved gods. I mean, it's a little strange. It's a little strange. But I think it only works if you can switch gods when you need to, when you feel like it. Another concept from Daoism, which I think is really useful, is that instead of defining human beings biologically, we define them by their commitments. And this concept could get really deep and should be another conversation because it really is important and deep. But you could think of each temple as a set of commitments, a set of rules. It translates to us like communal piety, like each temple's its own communal piety, but you didn't belong in the same way as you did to a church. You were a participant, a ritual supporter, but you could belong to multiple churches, temples, and they could have different sets of precepts, different rules of conduct. You could take a set of precepts for 6, instead of like the 10 commandments. Okay, your whole life, these are the 10, right? It's like you take on 6 commitments for a month, and so they're much more dynamic in that sense, much more adaptable to the current situation. But it doesn't lead to strong bonds between large groups of people. So then those larger polities have to be negotiated some other way. We got really far away from martial arts.
That's true. Well, I think it's good information. I want to do a little summary of, like, I'm going to say what I think your answer to my question was, is that if I am learning martial arts from someone who is far below me in caste and wants to keep me there, they will have in reserve perhaps these amazing balanced trickeries that they will imply directly or tacitly are high level things, and in fact they're to keep me coming back because I can't solve them yet. And
that's fun.
Yeah.
If you know that's what's happening, that's fun.
Right. I would contrast.
Man, I can't figure out this puzzle. I'm gonna get him next time, though.
Yeah, I mean that is actually really motivating, right? But I'm thinking of it in contrast to other things like the good heavens, like the red sand palm recipes, you know, where if you just do this incredibly tedious shit, excuse me, over and over, you will be able to, you know, smash extremely hard.
Coconuts.
Friends can do coconut. You can do the semi-wet kernel of an apricot with the back of his hand on a cutting board. Cool. You know, it's extremely impressive, but it's not necessarily. Maybe I'm being uncharitable, but it doesn't seem to be like you had to figure out a puzzle to do that. You just had to endure the recipe. And I feel like, so the things that are more obvious are, maybe I'm not going to give you the recipe, but once I've given you the recipe, if you do the recipe, you're going to get this slightly unusual thing. Right. Whereas these deceptions that you've sort of isolated as a category are things that you would speculate people would hold in reserve because they needed to protect themselves and because they were part of a group that needed to protect its resources in a way.
Okay. Yes, and yes, that's true. But let's bring it back to the Tantric Buddhism idea, right?
Okay.
So, like, because as a religious teacher, right, we're not thinking about martial artists as religious teachers, but they were roughly in that category. Mm-hmm. They were in the martial religious, right? It's like Wu Jiao is like a martial teaching, right? And remember, Tibetan Buddhism has come to us with all of these, you know, these images of the wrathful warriors. Mm-hmm. And in Chinese martial arts, you are the wrathful warrior, right? Mm-hmm. Like, so your teacher is the wrathful warrior, right? And so there's all this tantric stuff, you know, that's like, those changes can actually be thought of as enlightenment changes, right? Mm-hmm. And those disciplined practices can be thought of as rituals which transform your relationship to the human and natural world. You know, your resilience in it. It's this is sort of obvious, right? Like that's why people send their kids to kung fu school, so that they'll be better at leadership and interacting with other people. And it's sort of absurd. It's like, wait, you're teaching them this fighting skill and they're going to get better grades in school and they're going to care more about their fellow man. It's like, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's actually religious content, mm-hmm. right? That gets played out. And it's not just that the master is keeping secrets from you. It's that to get the secrets, you have to let go of your own aggression. If we're talking Taoist stuff, mm-hmm. we're not talking Taoist stuff. It might be, you know, dissolve illusion. If we're in the Buddhist realm, mm-hmm. We would talk about those transformations in different ways. You know, but that not getting something mm-hmm. creates its own energy, right? And maybe you get something new. Maybe you invent something new because you're blocked. You're like, mm-hmm. why can't I beat this little man? You know, like I have to change, right? You know, or like, or why do I want to beat this little man, right? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It's like mm-hmm. it if we open up mm-hmm. and see this in a bigger, you know, in a bigger frame of religious transformation, it isn't these deceptions aren't necessarily evil. They're not evil. They're games with our minds. Mm-hmm. They're games with our bodies. They're games with the computer interface of, well, all right, this metaphor maybe falls apart, but the who we are interact with the world, right? And maybe you get annoyed with your teacher, but I don't see people in the West opening up that question. Like, wait, why am I not as good as you? Like, what are you hiding? Like, no, what do you mean I haven't practiced enough? Like, what didn't I practice enough? Like, what's the fruition? What's the goal here? Who am I supposed to be able to fight? Like, all the questions people aren't asking. But if you jump back and you go, oh, this comes from a religious theater tradition, the types of questions you're going to ask are bigger. Like, oh, well, how can this make me more spontaneous? How can this make me better at expressing myself about that? How can these tricks make my body more lively and calm at the same time? Something like that, right?
Yeah. I feel like you have actually answered my question, and I don't know if there's a timer running somewhere, but that was a very satisfying
loop back to the beginning.
Yeah.
Well, people have to try and remember what the question was, but
no, I really, well, at this point, so I'm thanking you by way of kind of making a little bit of a conclusion.
And that's where we ended it. Thank you, Daniel, for a great conversation, and thanks everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe and check out my books on Amazon.com.